The law is simple tonight: run or be ended. Wind scours the scrub as moonlight fractures on wet leaves, and something hungers without mercy. Ivy stumbled at the creek edge, heart a drum against the ribs. Mara moved like shadow poured from rock, every whisker tuned to breath. Rowan said, "Hold still, little one," though his voice was only memory in the trees. Kade laughed somewhere downwind, a gravel sound that knew weakness. The clouds sealed the stars, and the path narrowed to a throat. Water hissed over stone as if warning had teeth. I said, "This ground keeps score," and the reeds replied with a shiver. Ivy lifted her head, and the night lifted its knife. Mara paused, reading the air the way elders read scars. Kade said, "Run, make it sweet," and silence answered by tightening its jaw. A branch snapped. The creek flashed silver. Fear stepped forward wearing many faces. Ivy bolted and the earth kicked back. Mara chose the line that closes stories. The storm rolled in on black hooves. The first drop fell like a verdict. Ivy ran as if the night had teeth, and every shadow bit. The path braided through thorn and stone, drawing blood from air with each snag. I said, "Keep low, trust the ground," but the ground muttered of traps. Mara flowed behind, neither hurried nor slow, a patient river of muscle. Kade cut across wind, stealing distance the way hunger steals prayer. Rowan said, "Turn where the scent breaks," and the memory bent the grass. A bat flared out of a hollow, and vanished like a warning swallowed. The storm pressed its chest against the hills until the hills gave. Ivy crashed a branch, and the valley answered with echoes that sold her position. Mara blinked once, and discarded mercy. Kade grinned at the math of fear. The sky clenched a fist, and heat crawled along its knuckles. I said, "There is no later," and the trail narrowed to a thread. The creek forked and chose sides. Ivy veered right where reeds hid as shallows, and the water snatched at her legs. Mara tested a stone, and crossed without a sound. Kade said, "Split the gap," and the wind obliged. Lightning stitched the horizon, and unstitched courage. I said, "Every choice is a door that locks behind you." Rowan's scent lay faint on a broken fern, a compass older than fear. Ivy coughed river and kept moving, ribs flashing like pale wings. Mara tasted the air and mapped the future in a breath. Kade stumbled on a slick rock and swore with a grunt, then laughed at the slip. The storm swallowed its own thunder and saved the rest for later. Ivy cut through a tunnel of briar, and the briar took tribute. The acacia tunnel closed like a throat, and the air smelled of iron. Ivy slowed, listening for directions written in leaves. I said, "Silence is full of choices." Mara brushed a trunk, and bark dust glittered on her fur. Kade circled to kill the shortcuts, a cartographer of trouble. Rowan said, "Wind at your back means eyes ahead," and the lesson turned her ears. A horned beetle climbed a twig, and the twig snapped under rain weight. The first hard drops arrived like thrown pebbles. Ivy breathed once, and stepped into the narrowest seam. Mara's tail traced a question mark, and then flattened to an answer. Kade chuckled softly, the kind that breaks bones from the inside. The tunnel bent left, then left again, and every left felt wrong. The valley inhaled, and held it. Lightning finally found a reason, and cracked the ridge open. Ivy froze as white fire drew her outline for every hunter. I said, "Now or never is the only hour that counts." Mara launched, a verdict with claws. Kade surged to intercept, eyes bright with theft. The ground pitched under sudden rain, and smeared scent into chaos. Rowan said, "Choose the water," and the echo shoved. Ivy leaped toward the dark mouth beneath the roots, where the creek widened. The storm dumped its pockets, and the world blurred into moving glass. Mara clipped a branch and spun, then landed still lethal. Kade slid and ate mud, spitting grit and a curse. Ivy vanished into a curtain of reeds, and the night forgot her for one breath. Dawn cracked with a pale fire that bled across the soaked valley, and the storm dragged its tail away. Ivy shivered beneath roots, water dripping on her muzzle, lungs aching like drums. I said, "The world grants a pause, not mercy." Mara crouched high on the ridge, eyes unblinking, hunger folded into patience. Kade limped with mud caked on his flanks, tongue lolling with a grin that never closed. Rowan's memory lingered like smoke, telling her the silence was a warning, not a gift. Ivy's ears twitched at every drip, every rustle, every echo of pursuit. She whispered in her own chest, "Stay still, stay alive," though fear urged her legs to run again. The air carried the damp weight of leaves, crushed by rain and paw. Mara's tail flicked once, cutting the morning in half. Kade said, "She cannot vanish," and stalked the scent line with teeth bare. The creek sang low, a hymn written for survivors, not the lost. The forest woke in fragments. A crow shook feathers and launched into air, scattering cries across hollow trunks. Ivy lifted her head, ribs quivering with each shallow breath. I said, "The weight of living is heaviest in stillness." Mara stalked along the ridge, paw steps as silent as ash falling. Kade tested the mud with careful tread, nostrils flaring wide, scent pulling him forward like rope. Rowan's phantom voice said, "Follow where the ground breaks clean," yet the prints blurred under water's smear. The trees smelled of iron and sap, morning sun leaking into shards through gaps. Ivy pressed her muzzle deeper into shadow, every muscle locked. Mara paused, ears cupped forward, tail flat, her hunger cloaked in patience. Kade's laugh broke the rhythm of dawn, jagged as stone. The forest hushed again, waiting to see who paid the price. The air shifted with the smell of new grass, and for a heartbeat, the world softened. Ivy dared a step into light, hooves sinking into damp earth. I said, "Hope is bait sharpened by hunger." Mara slunk lower, shoulders rippling like river stones rolling. Kade quickened, forgetting limp, driven by scent that burned his lungs. Rowan said, "Beware the open," but Ivy needed more than hiding. A butterfly cut the air above her muzzle, fragile wings mocking the weight of pursuit. The wind rolled the scent into every mouth, stirring want and warning. Mara's eyes narrowed, claws flexed once. Kade snapped at empty air as if laughter had teeth. Ivy's ribs swelled with a breath that could betray her. The morning bent under invisible weight, waiting for the next cut. The creek narrowed into a throat of stone, its song louder than words. Ivy stepped onto the slick rocks, balance trembling. I said, "Every crossing demands a toll." Mara paced the bank, reading ripples as scripture. Kade slid into view, his shoulders rolling, grin stretched wide. Rowan's whisper said, "Trust the stones that do not shine." But the water glared with a mirror of risk. Ivy lowered her head and pushed across, spray biting her flanks. Mara's tail lashed once, decision carved in muscle. Kade's laugh tangled with the creek, rough and eager. The water foamed and tried to claim her hooves. I said, "The stream is honest. It takes without malice, but honesty still drowns." Ivy's leap landed sharp on a half-buried stone. Behind her, the predators closed their circle tighter. The forest opened into a meadow bruised by storm. Ivy collapsed to her knees, chest heaving, mud streaking her coat. I said, "Rest is betrayal when eyes still hunt." Mara crouched low in grass, a golden ember smoldering, unseen. Kade prowled the edge, circling wide, ears keen for weakness. Rowan's memory touched the air, saying, "Even wounds must move, or they fester." Ivy lifted her head, eyes glassed by fear and fire. The meadow wind flattened stalks like hands pressing her down. Mara's whiskers twitched, patience sharpened by hunger. Kade said, "The chase is never done," his voice jagged as the thorns. The sky cleared enough to show pale sun, cold and indifferent. I said, "Every heartbeat is borrowed." Ivy staggered up swaying, and the earth held its breath. Noon pressed hard, burning the rain from leaves, and the ground began to speak in scent again. Ivy limped through grass that flashed with insects and knives of light. I said, "Pain is a map that only points forward." Mara tracked in the lee of brush, a gold flame throttled low. Kade shook mud from his legs and tested each print with a chuckle. Rowan said, "Hold the wind where it cannot betray you," and the echo cooled her panic. A hawk screamed, and the meadow froze, then moved in fragments. Ivy tasted iron, and kept her head level to hide the lurch. Mara read the lay of burrows and the nerves of mice, choosing the quiet path. Kade said, "I love when hope slows," and angled wide to sheer escape into ribbons. Heat shimmered, bending distance into a lie. I said, "The day sharpens every edge," and the edge began to cut. The ridge threw a broken lattice of shade that smelled of sap and heat. Ivy slid under it and found breath that did not scrape. I said, "Shade forgives nothing, it only delays the bill." Mara drifted to higher stones where the wind told cleaner truths. Kade paced the lower game trail and hummed like a wheel with a cracked tooth. Rowan said, "Choose the path that keeps your outline broken," and the shadows stitched her shape apart. Ants carried a dead moth like a pale flag across a root. Ivy licked the dust from her lip and swallowed needles. Mara's tail wrote a patient sentence behind her heels. Kade snorted at a thorn and left a smear that bragged of hunger. The ridge turned, and the valley opened a mouth full of heat. I said, "Tight spaces end in choices you cannot unmake." Hunger tightened its belt and the world shrank to the sound of hooves and breath. Ivy stepped into a hollow where the ground sagged like a trap disguised as mercy. I said, "Soft soil remembers every fall." Mara paused, reading swirl marks where boar had rolled in night rain. Kade said, "Let the earth choose for us," and pushed toward the basin. Dragonfly stitched green light across the hollow air. Ivy placed weight, and the soil sighed. Rowan said, "Test before you trust," but urgency bent the lesson out of reach. Mara slid along the rim and mapped routes of exit and ruin. Kade's paw sank and he laughed at the pull. Ivy lunged and the crust broke like thin ice. I said, "Now the earth hunts too," and the basin opened its slow mouth. The struggle pulled sound from the basin, a wet grinding that chewed at courage. Ivy kicked sludge that clung like jealous hands. I said, "Panic fattens the mud." Mara measured distance, then chose a line through roots that could bear a leap. Kade lunged to close, dreaming of collapse shaped like supper. Rowan said, "Angle the force, not the fear," and the words lit a narrow door. Ivy twisted, found purchase on a root, and dragged one leg free with a gasp. Mara bounded once, landing light on a dry knob, then twice, paws whispering. Kade slipped on slime and barked a curse that startled birds into the noon. The basin spat bubbles that popped like small warnings. I said, "Prices paid in muscle," and the ledger added zeros. The rim gave way to thorn flats where air shimmered like a forge. Ivy burst free and ran with a limp that wrote pain across dust. I said, "Speed buys time, not safety." Mara touched ground and flowed after, breath even, heart cold and bright. Kade shook mud and found a rhythm that ate small distances quickly. Rowan said, "Choose the wind's blind spot," and the flats offered a thin seam of scentless air. Locust shells crackled under hooves like old promises. Ivy cut toward a lone fig that lifted a small island of shadow. Mara narrowed the angle to force a bad choice. Kade widened to steal the door. Heat rose in waves until the world quivered. I said, "Everything breaks at the hottest point," and the horizon began to split. The fig's shadow broke thin, offering less shelter than a lie. Ivy slowed under its limbs, lungs burning with a fire older than her blood. I said, "Shade can trick you into trust." Mara crouched in silence, golden frame hidden in grass, eyes narrow with questions. Kade circled wide, his path a crooked grin that drew the trap closed. The air shimmered with mirage until distance seemed fluid. Rowan whispered, "Sometimes survival is the lie you tell yourself," and her ears flicked to listen. Ivy bent her head, not from surrender but calculation, searching for openings where none waited. Mara's whiskers twitched with a revelation. This chase was more than hunger, it was test, lesson, Mirror. Kade muttered, "No one outruns the wheel," and his laugh broke like a branch under weight. I said, "The truth is a predator too," and the grass leaned in to hear. A gust rose, carrying a smell that shifted the story. Ashes, smoke, ruin. Ivy froze, nostrils wide, ears pivoting toward the unseen fire. I said, "The forest carries truths you cannot refuse." Mara's eyes narrowed, and for the first time hesitation colored her stride. Kade sniffed and spat, uneasy at a scent that mocked meat. Rowan said, "The world fights its own battles," and the echoes scattered like sparks. The horizon burned low and slow, a snake of flame eating dry scrub. Ivy stepped backward, not from predator, but from judgment. Mara flattened, calculating new laws written by smoke. Kade muttered, "This was not mine," and the grin slipped. I said, "Even hunters must bow to the greater hunger," and the crackle of fire answered with heat. The fire licked closer, bending grass into black ghosts. Ivy bolted sideways, not toward safety but toward uncertainty. I said, "Choice bends only once before it snaps." Mara followed, not to kill but to learn what the flames reveal. Kade hesitated, then snarled, drawn despite fear, because pursuit was in his bones. Rowan whispered, "Trust the path no one claims," and the air twisted into heat waves. Ivy's stride lengthened as ash swirled around her muzzle. Mara cut across, her silhouette etched in firelight, like a carving of will. Kade barked at smoke, eyes watering, still grinning through it. The land groaned as sparks crowned dry thorns. I said, "Here the hidden truth waits," and the sky glowed red with judgment. Smoke thickened, strangling sight, until the world shrank to sound. Ivy stumbled but pressed on, guided by instinct older than memory. I said, "Blindness is the truest teacher." Mara's whiskers trembled, body sliding close to earth, every step a question. Kade coughed and cursed, pawing at grit that clung like chains. Rowan whispered, ears over eyes, breath over sight, and the lesson folded into rhythm. Ivy lifted her head, following the crackle of water ahead. Mara caught it too, hope sharpened into her pupils. Kade laughed despite choking, because despair had always tasted sweet. The air glowed orange, and silhouettes swam in shifting curtains of smoke. I said, "The hidden truth is near," and the creek's voice pulled like a rope. The creek opened ahead, silver against the fire's mouth. Ivy lunged into its shallows, splashing judgment from her coat. I said, "Water cleanses only what survives it." Mara stopped short at the bank, eyes caught between hunger and reflection. Kade broke through smoke with a snarl, but faltered at the current's glare. Rowan said, "The river hides truth beneath its skin," and the words curled like ripples. Ivy lowered her head to drink, though her flanks still heaved. Mara's muscles eased, not defeated but transformed by revelation. Kade growled, yet his eyes betrayed unease, for water told him he was not master here. The flames hissed as they met the stream. I said, "The hidden truth is survival shared, not stolen," and silence finally spoke. Dusk folded the creek into a silver blade, and the fire's roar thinned to a rumor behind the hills. Ivy climbed the far bank and shook water like shattered glass. I said, "Night forgives speed but not noise." Mara rose from the reeds, a question written in muscle and breath. Kade ghosted the shallows, grin trimmed to focus. Rowan whispered, "Shadows are doors that swing one way," and the leaves clicked in agreement. Ivy steadied, ribs thrumming, eyes set on a dark corridor of brush. Mara angled to herd her into ground of advantage. Kade widened, cutting the arc like a patient saw. The frogs began a choir that hid small sins of movement. I said, "Climax is a tide," and the tide came in on quiet pause. Ivy leapt, and the world held its breath for the landing. The brush tightened into a funnel of thorn and dark. Ivy drove through, trading hair for distance. I said, "Pain is the toll you pay to cross." Mara curved left, reading wind like a map of veins. Kade pressed right, laughter swallowed to keep silence sharp. Rowan said, choose the ground that steals their footing, and gravel whispered under hooves. The air smelled of cold iron, clean after flame. Ivy burst onto open rock, where the moon pinned her with a pale nail. Mara launched, a verdict shaped like grace. Kade surged, a hammer built to finish the work. I said, now the world shrinks to breath and line, and every line ran toward a single point. Ivy pivoted, and time stuttered between beats. The leap met the pivot, and the night rang like iron. Ivy spun around her forelegs, dust blooming under the arc. I said, technique is the last shelter of the desperate. Mara sliced past, claws kissing stone, tail carving balance from chaos. Kade lunged into the gap, certain the opening belonged to him. Rowan whispered, angles outlive strength and geometry saved a life. Ivy cut low beneath the leap, slipping between fates that wanted her. Mara landed, eyes widened by surprise not failure. Kade skidded, stunned by empty air where victory should have stood. The moon sharpened edges until breath looked like smoke from a forge. I said the wheel turns, and the wheel bit back. Sound fell out of the world for a heartbeat, then rushed back in a flood. Ivy bolted downslope along a chute of shale that moved like water. I said, ride or be buried. Mara recovered in a breath and poured after her, precision stitched to speed. Kade tumbled, then found purchase with a growl that promised death. Rowan said, trust the fall if you can steer it, and the chute turned from enemy to road. Ivy surfed the sliding stones with ears flat and eyes bright. Mara matched paws landing where rock pretended to be solid. Kade thundered, betting weight against luck. The slope ended in a black ribbon of river, lined with teeth of root. I said, this is the narrowing, and the river opened its gate. The river took the moon and broke it into knives. Ivy hit the shallows and drove for the far bank where roots made ladders. I said, finish what breath began. Mara splashed after, a streak of gold smeared by water. Kade plowed through, daring the current to steal nothing from him. Rowan whispered, choose the rung that holds your weight, and the roots seemed to lean closer. Ivy climbed, hooves punching mud from the trunk skin. Mara closed, jaws open not with cruelty, but with need written honest. Kade rose behind, a blunt storm eager to end the math. The bank gave once, then gripped. I said, the heart declares its verdict, and the night waited for the sound of it. Ivy launched into brush, and the chase cracked in two ways. Dawn cracked thin and gray, brushing the forest with the color of ash. Ivy staggered through dripping ferns, flanks raw from the river's grip. I said, the world does not pause for wounds. Mara trailed near, eyes softer than the night before, hunger tempered by something unspoken. Kade limped in shadows, grin broken, yet the drive in his chest refused surrender. Rowan whispered, resolution is not peace but inevitability, and the branches bowed with dew. Ivy raised her head, meeting silence heavy as judgment. Mara halted, not for weakness but decision. Kade snarled and pressed on, unwilling to yield even to exhaustion. The forest sighed, its floor littered with damp leaves glowing faint silver. I said, the circle tightens, and every creature felt its weight. The air smelled of endings, sharp with frost where shadows still lingered. Ivy paused in a hollow where moss cushioned her trembling legs. I said, rest carves both gift and grave. Mara stepped forward, breath clouding, muscles coiled not for strike, but choice. Kade lurked, eyes rimmed red, body shaking from the chase's toll. Rowan said, every path splits in two, and both demand sacrifice. Ivy lowered her head, muzzle brushing damp moss, and sighed as if laying down memory. Mara's whiskers twitched, claws flexing once, then she sat back, breaking the rhythm of pursuit. Kade growled low, torn between rage and fatigue. Ah! The hollow brimmed with silence thick as stone. I said, hear the scales tilt, and the tilt shook the earth's bones. A crow called once, black against pale sky, and its cry split the hollow like a blade. Ivy lifted her head, eyes burning with refusal to fold. I said, even the weak carve final defiance. Mara blinked slowly, hunger twisting into respect, a predator pausing at the edge of kinship. Kade lunged, snapping teeth across silence, driven by despair turned violent. Rowan whispered, "One will fall so the other may endure," and the hollow echoed with the creed. Ivy stumbled forward, not away but through, cutting the air with sudden fire. Mara rose, muscles storming, intercepting the broken rush. Kade slammed into strength older than him, and the earth answered with thud and dust. I said, resolution costs blood, and blood was paid. The clash rang through the trees, claws sparking on stone, and cries torn raw from lungs. Ivy stumbled aside, her sides painted with dust and rain. I said, resolution spares none, only marks the survivor. Mara slashed, not to kill but to halt the frenzy. Kade's rage spilled, his weight reckless, jaws cutting air. Rowan whispered, wisdom is sharpest when blood blinds the eyes, and the forest listened. Ivy pressed against an oak, trembling yet unbroken. Mara shoved Kade down, muscles carving final truth into his hide. Kade writhed, his grin dying with his breath. Silence returned, thick, shrouding the hollow like a burial cloth. I said, every struggle finds its end, and the end had a name. The forest stilled as though it had held breath for centuries. Ivy stepped forward, shaking but alive, her gaze heavy with what was lost and spared. I said, resolution is not victory but continuation. Mara stood tall, breathing steady, her eyes not gloating but grave. Kade lay silent, the echo of his hunger swallowed by earth. Rowan whispered, every survivor carries ghosts, and the wind curled through branches with low hymn. Ivy touched the stream again, rinsing blood and fear from her muzzle. Mara turned away, tail low, shoulders bowed not in defeat but in reverence. The light grew stronger, spilling gold into the hollow. I said, the circle has closed, and silence returned as final witness. The day grew from the hollow like a slow breath, and the forest stitched its torn edges with light. Ivy moved between trunks, each step measured by ache and will. I said, survival is a sentence you keep rewriting. Mara followed at a distance that felt like respect rather than claim. The river's hush carried a calm that tasted of iron and rain. Rowan whispered, walk where the wind forgets your name, and leaves answered with small applause. Ivy paused at a clearing rim, and watched dust rise like ghosts. Mara sat, eyes lowered, and the air uncoiled its fear. I said, what was hunted now holds the pen, and the page turned without sound. The fire scar lay beyond the trees, a dark page written in ash and silence. Ivy crossed its edge, and did not flinch at the memory of heat. I said, loss is a teacher that never rests. Mara paced the boundary, reading the land as if it were a wound that could heal. A charred stump leaned like an old sentinel, black against thin blue sky. Rowan whispered, names fade, paths remain, and the wind pushed ash into soft curls. Ivy lowered her muzzle and tasted new shoots clawing through cinder. Mara watched with eyes that held no verdict. I said, life makes its argument in green, and a promise answered from the roots. From the ridge, the valley looked like a chest rising after a long hold of breath. Ivy stood where wind combed her coat into quiet ripples. I said, the body remembers fear, then relearns sky. Mara rested in the lee of stone, eyes half closed, listening more than seeing. A hawk wrote a bright line overhead, and vanished into glare. Rowan whispered, hold the open without breaking, and the echo softened. Ivy blinked slow, as if counting the seconds she had earned. Mara exhaled a thin cord that did not sharpen to hunger. I said, the world keeps turning even when you stop to feel it, and the turning felt kind for once. The river bent into gentler speech, braiding light into its surface as if repairing old words. Ivy entered shallows, and let the current read her stories clean. I said, peace is not soft, it is earned muscle laid down. Mara stepped to the bank and lowered her head, not to drink first, but to watch. Dragonflies stitched blue sparks over the water and vanished. Rowan whispered, "Share the crossing," and Time listened without argument. Ivy lifted her face, and the day mirrored back a steadier gaze. Mara drank then, slow and deliberate, breaking nothing she did not need. I said, "Some endings choose quiet." And the quiet held. Twilight gathered like a solemn promise, and the first stars spoke through the leaves. Ivy stood at the forest edge where paths split, and none demanded blood. I said, "What is left is enough." Mara watched from shadow, eyes bright, no hunger in their fire, only witness. The breeze turned pages in the grass, and then closed the book. Rowan whispered, "Remember breath, not fear." And the night agreed. Ivy stepped into the dim, taking the road that did not tremble. I said one final line, the earth kept her, and the silence answered with a heartbeat you could almost hear.